President Trump has landed another victory centered on trade. The Senate yesterday overwhelmingly approved his agreement with Mexico and Canada, the USMCA. It now heads for the president's desk to be signed into law sometime next week. Now, it comes after the signing of the Phase 1 trade deal with China, and as the administration now preps for a tariff fight with European leaders, so multiple fronts in play. Joining me now with more on a very busy week for trade pacts, senior fellow at the National Taxpayers Union, Mattie Duppler. She is also the president of Forward Strategies, also managing director of economic policy for the Center for American Progress, Andy Green as well. Thank you both for joining us this morning. Let's kick off the conversation, Mattie, to you first, ladies first, about whether or not these trade agreements in total are a step forward for the United States.
Well, good morning, Dom. I would think that when you look at what happened this week with trade, we are in a good position in the United States. Now, certainly over the last 18 months, the threat of tariffs have created a lot of downward pressure for an otherwise pretty robust economy. But I do think that you look at what's happened this week, the United States has quite a bit of leverage here. As you mentioned, there's a lot of different trade fights that are still hovering on the horizon that are not just the U.S.-China, but having U.S.-China deal inked this week, particularly when we've got a lot of movement on impeachment, I think is important because for many, many months now, we've heard a lot of opponents of the president talk about how impeachment is going to prevent getting anything done in Washington. That simply isn't the case. Not only do you have the signing of the Phase 1 deal, you've got USMCA, the president's top legislative priority for the year, getting passed through the Senate. So I think that the wind is at the back of the administration as they pursue other trade efforts headed into the new year, which, by the way, of course, is an election year.
All right, so there's one perspective. Andy, let's turn to you for a bit of the other side. There has been a cost to what's happened with the trade war, not just with China, but with other fronts as well. Take us through whether or not the economic impacts can be recovered and whether there is a path forward for the U.S. economy, despite the fact that there have been these tensions with these major trading partners.
Well, I mean, the trade deals that we've seen pass through the Senate and get signed by the president this week are a lot of bluster and a very little amount of delivery. And what really has been delivered is credit to Speaker Nancy Pelosi, not really to President Trump. So, you know, we've seen a manufacturing slowdown across the economy. It's fifth straight month of manufacturing contracted. We're continuing to see the job market gains slow down, and we're continuing not to see wage growth trickle down to ordinary workers. So this is an economy that's working for the top 1%, just like the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the massive tax cut that President Trump succeeded in passing. That went to the very top. It went to the 1%. The bottom 60% of workers got a 15% of the benefits of that. And that's exactly what these trade deals are going to deliver. And I'd just also like to add, it's very clear that unlike the USMCA, where Speaker Pelosi secured meaningful wins on labor rights, there's nothing in the China trade deal for workers. Instead, it's a very large giveaway for Wall Street and along with big ag. So I'm very pessimistic about what this is going to mean for ordinary working Americans.
All right. So Mattie, I want to turn to you here. There are some points being brought up by Andy with regard to what the actual coverage is for benefit in terms of these trade deals in the U.S. economy. What exactly can be done, if anything, to really expand how many people benefit from these trade deals in, say, the Phase 2 for China and the upcoming negotiations with Europe?
Yeah, well, certainly with the U.S.-China deal, the cornerstone of that is the $200 billion more in purchases that China is required to make, not just from agricultural commodities here in the United States, but from manufacturing, from the services sector. That is certainly where you'll see a worker impact. But, you know, we have a realignment happening right now on trade in the United States. Certainly the president has rejected what is Republican orthodoxy on how markets can manage trade. But look at what happened in the Senate. You've got 89 votes for USMCA. You've got Chuck Schumer and Pat Toomey from Pennsylvania voting together, while Sherrod Brown and Rand Paul are on the same page on USMCA. So I think that when you look at the impact for workers in the United States and you look at the politics of trade, that is changing, and I'm not sure that we know exactly where that's going to land. Certainly this focus on workers is an important one. I disagree with Andy on both the impact on TCJA and what's happening in the United States and the economy right now. But if you look going into 2020, the important factors that have put downward pressure on the economy, that's the Fed and U.S.-China trade, are now ameliorated. So I think we'll see still a lot of economic activity pick up, and particularly going into the election year, that's going to be important for President Trump.
Andy, I will turn to you for the last word here. This is an election year and one where President Trump is going to try to make a case for his continued presidency, and Democratic rivals will try to get into the White House. What exactly should the narrative be for any candidate with regard to how they say the American public is better off because of trade?
Well, it's very clear that President Trump has picked up the narrative that the Democrats have argued for a long time, which is that trade and globalization, unregulated, without rules for workers, the environment, things to bring down the high cost of prescription drugs, that's not going to work for working families. It's going to work for Wall Street. And the only time that he's able actually to get successes is when Speaker Pelosi has gone in and cleaned up the mess he did with the first round of USMCA. So I think that really the narrative is he's identified the problem correctly, but when he's left to his own devices, as the example of the China trade quote deal, he's delivering for his allies on Wall Street. He's not delivering for workers. And I think that ordinary people will continue to feel the pain and continue to recognize that reality.
All right, it'll be a centerpiece of the debate on the economy in this presidential election cycle. Mattie Duppler, Andy Green, thank you guys very both for that debate on what's happening with trade. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Tom.
Well, Comcast NBC